The following story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, businesses, incidents, and events portrayed in this production are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual events, locations, or persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental and not intended by the creators. Vantros Estates died on a stormy Thursday evening in late November, inside a high-rise downtown Seattle boardroom, while the city below rushed home through the freezing rain. The multi-million-dollar real estate empire was foreclosed for $140 million by a shadow developer Alden Vantros knew intimately. Someone who had sat at his dinner table for 30 years. Someone who had spent his entire life in the shadow of the patriarch, designing the very towers that defined the city's skyline. His own eldest son, Julian Vantros. Foreclosure notice was served on a mahogany table that had been polished just that morning. A table where Alden Vantros had signed dozens of multi-million-dollar deals over a 30-year career. The red-bordered legal document sat under the heavy glass Corporate Excellence Awards, casting a long shadow across the marble floor. This is the story of how a family enterprise built on pride, nurtured through corporate favoritism, and ending in cold-blooded betrayal became a financial execution that dismantled a real estate dynasty. The foundation of the Vantros family was cracked long before the concrete of their buildings failed. It began 25 years earlier when Julian Vantros' mother passed away, leaving a quiet 7-year-old boy to sketch alone in the corner of his father's booming office. Alden Vantros, the ruthless patriarch, built his reputation on aggressive land acquisition and high-stakes lobbying, valuing public praise far above actual architectural competence. He expected his son to be a loud salesman, not a quiet student of structural mathematics. Within 3 years, Alden remarried Alina, a sophisticated, manipulative socialite who immediately set about erasing Julian's mother's memory from the family files. Alina brought with her a rigid corporate ambition and her own young son, Marcus. Marcus Vantros was a child of empty charisma and shallow business degrees. He was groomed by Alina to be the public face of the company, spending his afternoons at country clubs while Julian worked long hours in the basement. Julian, meanwhile, grew up in the shadow of his half-brother, quietly securing a degree in structural engineering and joining the firm as an invisible drafting assistant. He spent 5 years calculating structural loads while Marcus received the public credit. By the time Julian was 30, the company was preparing to build its greatest project, the Oasis. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar smart city development designed to elevate Vantros Estates to a national player. Julian designed every detail of the Oasis, working 80-hour weeks in the quiet, windowless basement office. He chose the precision of the drafting table over the noisy political battlegrounds of the corporate boardroom, trusting his work to speak for itself. On a rainy Tuesday evening in October, Marcus Vantros walked into Julian's basement office. He claimed Alden wanted a direct review of the final structural blueprints before the morning's board meeting. Trusting his brother's rare show of interest, Julian handed over the master digital drives containing 5 years of structural calculations. He believed they were working toward a common family legacy. The next morning, Julian arrived at the headquarters to find his security badge deactivated. The guard, whose son's college fund Julian had quietly supported, could not look him in the eyes. Julian was escorted by security to the executive boardroom where Alden and Marcus sat in silence. On the projection screen, Julian's Oasis blueprints were displayed, but the title block now bore Marcus's name as the sole architect. Alden looked at his eldest son with cold detachment, accusing Julian of attempting to steal Marcus's designs to sell to competitors. Marcus had fabricated network logs to frame his brother. Without allowing Julian to present his sketchbooks, Alden announced that the board had voted to strip his shares. He declared Julian officially terminated and written out of his will. Marcus offered Julian a mockingly small severance package on the condition that he sign a non-disclosure agreement. It was designed to bury Julian's career and silence the truth about the Oasis. Julian looked at the document, then at his brother. He did not scream, he did not make threats, and he did not sign. He slowly stood up and walked out of the room in absolute silence. Julian's silence was not a sign of surrender, but the first move in a calculated war. He knew Vantros Estates had committed their entire financial reserve to the Oasis, relying on highly leveraged bank loans. They believed they had neutralized Julian by taking his job and his inheritance. They did not realize that by cutting his ties, they had freed him from the ethical constraints of family loyalty. Julian returned to his small apartment, packed his design journals, and closed his bank accounts. He knew that to destroy a concrete giant, he had to understand the cracks in its foundation. Marcus publicly announced the Oasis project the next week, standing before a crowd of wealthy investors. He took credit for every green innovation and structural breakthrough Julian had calculated. The local media praised Marcus as a visionary developer. Alden sat in the front row, his chest puffed with pride, believing he had secured the family's legacy and validated his choices. But Marcus had one fatal flaw. He was an incompetent manager who did not understand the structural mathematics of the blueprints he had stolen. He saw the project only as a marketing campaign. Marcus immediately began making unauthorized changes to the project's structural specifications to cut costs, replacing Julian's high-grade concrete formulas with cheaper, low-quality C30 alternatives. He believed that what was hidden behind the drywall would never be noticed by the city inspectors. He did not realize that Julian was watching their progress from a distance, tracking every permit. To fund their construction schedule, Vantros Estates took out a massive $80 million construction loan from a syndicate of regional banks. They used their entire portfolio as collateral. They were running on paper-thin margins, counting on the immediate sale of the Oasis luxury units. Any delay in the project's completion would trigger a severe liquidity crisis they could not survive. While they celebrated their triumphs, Julian quietly contacted Victoria Sterling, the chief executive officer of Stellara Group and Alden's fiercest competitor. Victoria was a woman who valued data over empty names. Julian presented Victoria with a detailed proposal for a rival development that would render the Oasis obsolete. He called it the Aventro, a project executed with flawless, high-grade engineering. Victoria recognized the value of the blueprints. She offered Julian full creative control and a 20% equity stake in the new venture, establishing Aventro Development as a subsidiary of the Stellara Group. Julian was no longer an invisible family employee in the basement. He was a partner in an enterprise designed to systematically dismantle his father's legacy. Julian spent the next 6 months hiring top structural engineers and concrete suppliers, ensuring every phase of the Aventro project exceeded building safety standards. He wanted a monument to structural integrity. Aventro secured zoning permits and broke ground on a prime downtown plot just 2 miles from the Oasis. The battle lines were officially drawn in concrete and steel, though the Vantros family remained unaware. When Alden heard about the Aventro, he dismissed it as a desperate attempt by Victoria Sterling to copy his family's success. He remained confident that Marcus's Oasis project would dominate the market. Marcus even mocked the Aventro in a local business journal, claiming their design lacked the scale of the Oasis. He did not realize his own project was built on compromised concrete. Julian read the interview and smiled quietly. He knew Marcus's arrogance was his greatest ally, blinding his half-brother to the growing physical defects of the Oasis while he focused on marketing. Meanwhile, the Oasis was already running into structural complications. Marcus's choice of cheap concrete resulted in micro-cracks in the load-bearing walls of the western parking garage. Instead of halting construction to repair the foundation, Marcus ordered his team to patch the cracks with cosmetic grout. He was terrified a delay would trigger interest penalties from the bank. Marcus believed he could outrun the defects by transferring the liability to future homeowners. He did not realize Julian had hired independent structural auditors to document every compromised corner. Julian compiled a comprehensive file containing time-stamped images of the failing foundation and material delivery invoices. Every invoice proved Marcus was buying concrete rated far below safety limits. The Aventro project grew rapidly under Julian's supervision, with the steel framework rising ahead of schedule. The local business community began to take notice of their superior design and rapid progress. Victoria Sterling used her vast network to secure pre-sales for the Aventro commercial spaces, attracting premium retail brands that had originally considered the Oasis. They preferred their certified safety standards. As pre-sales for the Aventro surged, Vantros Estates faced a sudden slump in interest for their luxury units. Savvy buyers were beginning to question the rapid pace of construction and the cheap finishes Marcus had chosen. Marcus, feeling the pressure of declining pre-sales and mounting interest payments, made a desperate decision. He fired the chief financial officer for refusing to approve off-balance sheet loans. Marcus replaced the CFO with a close associate of Alina, a compliant accountant named Donald, who was willing to manipulate the company's accounting journals to make it appear profitable. Under Donald's supervision, Vantros Estates began hiding their mounting construction liabilities inside shell companies. They painted a picture of financial health while bleeding cash every month. But the bank syndicate was getting nervous, demanding an independent progress audit of the Oasis before releasing the final $30 million tranche. Marcus had to show physical progress at any cost. To expedite construction, Marcus forced subcontractors to work double shifts, neglecting concrete curing times. The site became a chaotic, dangerous race against the bank's audit deadline. Julian received weekly reports from the construction site, documenting every shortcut. He knew Marcus was building a house of cards on a cracked foundation, and the financial wind was starting to pick up. While they rushed construction, Julian focused on the Aventro marketing campaign, highlighting their certified engineering warranties. They were offering buyers safety and transparency, not just empty luxury. The strategy worked, and by the end of the year, the Aventro had secured 80% pre-sales for its primary residential tower, capturing the market share Vantros estates desperately needed. Vantros estates' cash reserves were officially depleted, and the bank syndicate refused to release the final loan tranche, citing construction irregularities discovered during their audit. Faced with a complete halt in construction, Marcus turned to private shadow lenders, seeking high-interest short-term bridge loans to keep the project alive. He believed he could refinance the debt once they opened. Marcus signed a $25 million bridge loan with a private equity firm called Parix Capital, agreeing to a punitive 15% interest rate and pledging their remaining assets as collateral. What Marcus did not know was that Parix Capital was not a traditional investment firm. It was a shell corporation created by Victoria Sterling and funded entirely by Julian's design profits. Julian had quietly created Parix Capital to act as the financial net that would catch their falling assets. By signing that loan, Marcus had handed Julian the keys to his company's vault. Alina, believing she had saved the family business, began bragging to her social circles about Marcus's financial brilliance. She claimed Vantros Estates was untouchable, despite the rival project. But the reality inside their offices was far from celebratory. The interest payments to Parix Capital were eating up what little cash they had left, forcing Marcus to make deeper cuts. He stopped paying their primary suppliers, delaying payments by 90 days and triggering a series of worker strikes on the Oasis construction site. The project fell even further behind. Julian watched their supplier disputes with close attention. He knew that the subcontractors were the lifeblood of the project, and by alienating them, Marcus was ensuring that no one would stand by him. Julian quietly contacted their primary steel supplier, Thomas, a distant relative Alden Vantros had cut out of the family circle years ago. Thomas held a deep grudge against the patriarch. Julian offered Thomas a long-term supply contract for the Aventro on the condition that he demand immediate payment for all outstanding invoices from Vantros estates. This accelerated their cash squeeze. Thomas agreed, and the next morning he filed a formal payment demand for $3 million of outstanding steel deliveries, threatening to file a mechanics lien against the Oasis property. This payment demand triggered a default clause in their Parix Capital loan agreement, giving Julian the legal right to audit their financial books and inspect the construction site. Marcus tried to block the auditors, but Julian's legal team had drafted the loan agreement with clinical precision. He was forced to open his books and allow access to their private servers. The forensic team, led by a brilliant accountant named Sarah, spent 2 weeks tracing their financial transactions. They discovered a systematic pattern of embezzlement and fraudulent billing. They had been transferring corporate funds into private offshore accounts, using dummy subcontractors to invoice the company for work that was never performed. It was a massive tax fraud scheme. Julian compiled all the evidence of their financial crimes into a secure digital drive, keeping it safe in a private bank vault. He had the ammunition to send Marcus and Alina to prison. He knew that if he exposed their financial fraud now, the banks would foreclose and sell the property at a discount, allowing the family to escape the structural liabilities of the cracked foundation. Julian needed the construction of the Oasis to be completed and the building occupied so that the liability would be locked into their name. He wanted them to own the structural collapse. So he allowed Marcus to refinance his supplier debt by extending their Parix Capital loan, adding a series of strict covenants that pledged their personal real estate holdings as security. Marcus, believing he had outmaneuvered his creditors, signed the amendment without reading the fine print. He was too focused on the upcoming grand opening of the Oasis to notice the net closing. Alina was already planning a massive grand opening gala, inviting the city's elite to celebrate the completion of the tower. She wanted the event to be a showcase of their family's social dominance. Julian watched their preparations with quiet anticipation. He knew that the stage they were building for their triumph would become the very stage of their public undoing. We completed the primary structure of the Aventro that same month, receiving our certificate of occupancy ahead of schedule. The contrast between our efficiency and their chaotic rush was clear. Our commercial tenants began moving in, and the local press praised the Stellara Group for delivering a world-class project. Julian remained in the shadows, letting Victoria take the public credit. Alden Vantros looked at our success with a growing sense of unease. He could see that the Aventro was drawing the city's attention away, and he pressed Marcus to accelerate their grand opening date. Marcus complied, scheduling the gala for the middle of next month despite warnings from their lead engineer that the concrete foundation in the western garage was unstable. The engineer was fired the next morning, replaced by a compliant consultant who signed off on the safety certifications without conducting a physical inspection. The path was clear for the gala. Julian received a copy of the falsified safety certificate within hours of its signing. He added it to our dossier, knowing it was the final piece of evidence that would prove criminal negligence. The stage was set, the debt was secured, and the cracks in their foundation were growing wider every day. Julian prepared to attend the grand opening gala, not as a guest, but as the shadow architect. The quiet years of design and calculations were over. The time had come to step out of the basement office and into the light of the boardroom where the final accounts would be settled. The week of the grand opening arrived, and the Vantros family operated in a state of manic confidence. Alina spent $500,000 on the catering, music, and decoration for the Oasis Gala alone. They invited 300 of the city's wealthiest investors, politicians, and media figures, hoping to secure the remaining condominium sales that would save them from public bankruptcy. But behind the scenes, their financial house of cards was collapsing. Parex Capital had quietly acquired 70% of Vantros estate's outstanding corporate bonds from the regional banks. We spent the last 3 months buying up their debt, capitalizing on the bank's eagerness to offload their exposure to a high-risk project. Julian was now their largest single creditor. Alden Vantros had no idea that the private firm holding their debt was owned by the son he had discarded. He believed Parex Capital was a friendly investment group that would extend their credit. Julian had structured the debt acquisitions so that all their corporate notes would mature on the day of the Oasis grand opening. It was a financial dead end they had no way of escaping. If they could not pay the matured bonds, Parex Capital had the legal right to declare them in default and seize the collateral, which included their headquarters and their family estate. Marcus was too busy planning his opening speech to notice the maturity dates, relying on Donald to manage the financial calendar. Donald, however, was secretly cooperating with Julian. Donald had provided the master keys to their private accounting servers, allowing Julian's team to download every email and spreadsheet detailing their tax evasion and fraudulent billing. Julian spent the nights before the gala reviewing their internal communications. It was a record of absolute greed, with Marcus openly discussing how to cheat concrete testing reports to save money. The evidence was complete, the legal filings were prepared, and our team was ready to move. We had coordinates for every asset they owned and every bank account they used to hide money. While he finalized the legal strategy, Julian visited the Oasis site one last time in the middle of the night, wearing a hard hat and a high-visibility vest to blend in with the remaining crew. Julian walked down to the western parking garage, the area where the structural cracks had been cosmetically patched. He could hear the faint, ominous sound of concrete grinding under the tower's weight. It was a structural disaster waiting to happen. The load-bearing columns were bowing under the pressure, and the cosmetic grout was already beginning to flake off, exposing the rusted rebar. Julian took high-resolution photos of the failing columns, adding them to our file of evidence. He knew the building was unsafe and that the grand opening gala would put hundreds of lives at risk. Julian immediately contacted the chief structural inspector for the city, Robert, a man of absolute integrity who had been bypassed by my family's political allies during the initial inspections. Julian presented Robert with our complete dossier of engineering reports, core sample tests, and photos of the failing columns. He did not ask him to shut down the building, he simply handed him the facts. Robert looked at the reports, his face turning pale as he realized the severity of the danger. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and announced that he was launching an emergency inspection immediately. Julian walked out of his office and called Victoria. He told her that the fuse was lit and that we needed to prepare the final default notices for delivery to the Vantros boardroom the next morning. Victoria confirmed that our legal team was in position at the county courthouse, ready to file the default petitions and freeze their bank accounts the moment the city inspector issued his report. Every exit was closed, every escape route blocked. The Vantros family headed into the grand opening gala believing they were at the peak of their success, completely unaware of the cliff ahead. Julian went back to his office, sat down at his desk, and watched the clock. The countdown had begun, and the family that had stolen his work was about to pay the full price of their arrogance. The silent revenger does not strike with anger or noise. He strikes with the cold, unyielding weight of the truth, allowing the betrayer's own greed to pull the trigger on their destruction. Julian took a slow breath, stood up, and walked out to his car. The stage was set, the guests were arriving, and the shadow architect was ready to watch the walls come down. The grand opening gala was in full swing when Julian arrived, the parking lot filled with luxury cars and the air thick with the sound of jazz music and clinking glasses. Julian walked through the lobby, observing his family from a distance as they stood in the center of the room, surrounded by local politicians and media cameras. Alden Vantros was holding a glass of champagne, his face flushed with pride as he spoke to reporters. He was telling them that the Oasis was the culmination of his life's work. Marcus stood beside him, nodding agreement and taking credit for the structural innovations that had made the tower possible. He looked like a man who believed his own lies. Alina managed the event with demanding authority, ordering the catering staff around and ensuring that every detail was perfect for the cameras. None of them saw Julian standing in the shadows watching their triumph with quiet, clinical precision. He was not there to celebrate, he was there to witness their eviction. At exactly 8 o'clock, the city inspection vehicles arrived at the front entrance of the tower, their amber lights flashing against the glass facade of the lobby. Robert walked into the lobby, accompanied by 4 structural engineers and 2 police officers. He marched directly to the security desk, ignoring the receptionist's attempts to stop him. Alden, seeing the commotion, walked over with a frown. He demanded to know why the city was disrupting his private opening gala with such a dramatic show of authority. Robert did not back down, presenting Alden with a formal emergency evacuation order and structural closure certificate. He announced that the building was unsafe and must be cleared. The news spread through the ballroom like wildfire, the music stopping suddenly as security guards began directing guests toward the emergency exits. Marcus tried to argue with the inspector, claiming the safety certifications were in order and that the closure was a political stunt. Robert ignored him, ordering police to secure the building. The media cameras, which had been invited to record the family's triumph, now recorded their public humiliation, capturing wealthy guests fleeing the building under flashing lights. Alina was screaming at the catering staff, trying to save the expensive decorations while police cleared the room. Her social dominance was dissolving in the rain. Within an hour, the glittering Oasis Tower was completely dark, surrounded by yellow police tape and warning signs. The project was now a vacant liability. The family gathered in the corporate boardroom across the street, their faces pale and their voices trembling. They knew that the closure would trigger default on their bank loans. They had no cash, no credit, and no way to pay the matured interest on their debt. They were staring into the abyss of financial ruin, and the clock was ticking toward midnight. Alden looked at his wife and son, his voice hollow as he realized the truth. He announced that they had only one option left. They had to call Parek's Capital and beg for help. The call to Parek's Capital was made at midnight, Alden pleading for an emergency meeting. He was told that the managing director would meet them in their boardroom at 9 the next morning. They spent the night in their offices, desperately trying to find a legal loophole or a financial asset they could use to appease their creditors. They found nothing but unpaid invoices. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Alden, Marcus, and Alina sat at the boardroom table, waiting for the arrival of the Parek's Capital representative who held their fate. The double doors opened slowly and Julian walked into the room, accompanied by Victoria Sterling and their legal team. Julian wore a tailored charcoal suit, carrying the black binder. Alden stood up in shock, his mouth opening in disbelief as he saw the son he had cast out. He demanded to know what Julian was doing there with their competitor. Julian did not answer directly, walking to the head of the table and sitting in the chair Alden had occupied for 30 years. He placed the heavy black binder on the polished wood. Marcus sneered, telling Julian that he was a trespasser who had no right to be in their boardroom. He threatened to call building security and have Julian thrown out. Julian looked at Marcus and spoke in a quiet, steady voice that silenced the room. He told Marcus that security would no longer obey him because Parek's Capital now owned the building. Alden's face turned pale as he realized the truth. He looked at Victoria Sterling, asking if it was true that Parek's Capital had bought their debt and if Julian was representing them. Victoria nodded coldly, confirming that Parek's Capital owned their $80 million construction loan and all corporate bonds. She added that Julian was the sole managing director. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The family was staring at the man they had thrown to the streets, now holding their entire world in his hands. Julian opened the black binder, presenting Alden with a formal default notice for their matured bonds. He told them they were in default and that Paragon was exercising foreclosure. Alden Vantros stared at the document, his hands shaking so violently he could not pick it up. He pleaded with Julian, reminding him that they were family and that destroying the firm destroyed the name. Julian reminded his father that he had stripped Julian's shares, written him out of the will, and accused him of espionage without hesitation. Julian was no longer his son, he was his creditor. Marcus, realizing the extreme danger, tried to negotiate, offering to hand over management of the Oasis to Julian if he would agree to refinance the debt and withdraw the notices. Julian declined, telling Marcus he had no interest in managing a building with a cracked foundation and a falsified safety certificate. He placed the photos of the columns on the table. Marcus stared at the photos, his face turning gray as he realized Julian had documented their structural shortcuts. He tried to claim the photos were fake, but his voice lacked strength. Julian then turned to Alina, who sat silently at the end of the table, trying to maintain her composure. He slid a copy of their forensic accounting audit report toward her. Julian told her that the report detailed the $15 million she and Marcus had embezzled from construction funds over the last 3 years, listing every offshore account. He added that they had already submitted the audit report and falsified safety certificates to the state prosecutor's office, who were launching a criminal investigation that morning. Alina gasped, tears of panic finally breaking through her cold facade as she realized that her social status, her wealth, and her freedom were dissolving in the face of the evidence. Alden Vantros looked at his wife and his golden child, the depth of their betrayal and incompetence finally sinking in. He realized they had destroyed the company he spent 50 years building. Marcus tried to run for the door, but 2 plainclothes detectives were already standing in the hallway, accompanied by security officers who had been instructed to cooperate. They entered the boardroom presenting Marcus and Alina with arrest warrants for corporate embezzlement, tax fraud, and criminal negligence. The room became a quiet crime scene. Julian watched in silence as his half-brother and stepmother were escorted out of the room in handcuffs, their silent exit a stark contrast to the noisy arrogance they had displayed. Alden Vantros was left sitting alone at the table, a broken man in an empty boardroom, surrounded by the ruins of his company and the evidence of his family's crimes. Alden looked up at Julian, his voice a hoarse whisper as he asked what Julian was going to do with him and the remaining assets. He had absolutely nothing left to fight with. Julian told Alden he was foreclosing on all collateral, including the family estate and company headquarters. He would transfer viable assets to Aventro, leaving Vantros' estates bankrupt. Julian added that he would purchase the family estate from the bankruptcy trustee, but he would not live there. He would convert the mansion into a public park and design archive. Alden closed his eyes, a single tear running down his cheek as he realized that the legacy he fought to preserve was now gone, replaced by a monument to the son he had discarded. Julian stood up, closed the black binder, and handed his father a pen. He told Alden he needed to sign the voluntary asset transfer agreement to avoid criminal prosecution. Alden opened his eyes, looked at the pen, and slowly reached out his hand. He signed the document in a trembling, uneven script, officially ending the era of Vantros' estates. Julian took the signed agreement, placed it in his portfolio, and nodded to his legal team. The transaction was complete, and ownership of their world had officially changed hands. Julian walked out of the boardroom, leaving Alden alone in the empty space. He did not feel anger, and he did not feel triumph. He felt only the satisfaction of a job well designed. The media was waiting outside, their cameras flashing as they tried to get a statement about the sudden closure of the Oasis and the arrest of the Vantros executives. Julian walked past them without saying a single word, ignoring their questions as he got into the back of Victoria's waiting sedan. He had no need for public credit. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic as rain began to fall. Julian looked back at the darkening tower of the Oasis, its empty glass facade reflecting the storm. They had believed they could build success on a foundation of lies and betrayal, treating the people who built their world as disposable. They forgot that foundations settle. By attempting to bury his work, they had simply given Julian the perfect vantage point to study their structure, finding the exact point of leverage where a single quiet push would bring it down. Vantros' estates was gone, Marcus and Alina faced years in prison, and Alden was left with nothing but his name. The accounts were balanced, and the silent architect reclaimed his blueprints. Julian opened his new design journal, took out a pencil, and began sketching the first lines of his next project. The past was settled, the slate was clean, and the future was his to design. For sometimes the most powerful structures are not the ones that stand tallest in the light, but the ones built quietly in the shadow, waiting for the right moment to claim the ground. The bankruptcy of Vantros' estates was finalized in federal court just 3 weeks later, with all remaining assets liquidated to pay off outstanding creditors and bondholders. Herrick's Capital purchased their corporate headquarters, land bank, and intellectual property for a fraction of value, merging them into the expanding Aventro development. Julian walked into the Vantros' estates headquarters as the new owner, accompanied by a team of young architects who had worked with him in the basement offices. They spent the first day clearing out executive suites, removing portraits of the founders and expensive trophies. They were resetting the company's culture from the top down. Julian moved his simple drafting table into Alden's old office, the massive corner room overlooking the city skyline that Alden had used to rule his family empire with fear. Julian kept the room clean, focused, and dedicated to the actual work of design, engineering, and structural honesty, refusing any ostentatious executive furniture. Alina's trial was scheduled for the fall, with the prosecutor presenting the forensic audit report as the primary evidence of their systematic financial crimes. She was facing up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, her wealthy social circles having completely abandoned her the moment the grand jury indictment was announced. Marcus, facing charges of criminal negligence and safety certification fraud, was offered a plea deal in exchange for testifying against their offshore banking associates. He refused the deal at first, but his arrogance dissolved when his defense attorneys explained the strength of the concrete testing evidence Julian had compiled. Marcus eventually signed the plea agreement, pleading guilty to corporate fraud and receiving a 5-year sentence in a medium-security facility with no early parole. Alden Vantros was not indicted, the prosecutor finding no evidence that he was directly aware of the embezzlement or the concrete safety certification fraud. Alden was, however, left bankrupt, his personal assets having been seized to satisfy the guarantees he signed for the construction loans, losing his house and reputation. Julian purchased the family estate from the bankruptcy trustee for $5 million in cash, saving it from being demolished by commercial developers. Julian did not move into the mansion, refusing to live in the house where he had been treated as an outcast for 30 years. He had other plans for the property. Julian donated the entire estate to the city's architectural society, converting the mansion into a public library, research archive, and community park. The grand ballroom where Alina had planned her social triumph was now a public lecture hall filled with young students learning the principles of sustainable design. Alden visited the park one sunny afternoon, walking through the gardens he had owned for decades, now filled with families, playing children, and student designers. He sat on a wooden bench under a large oak tree, looking at the plaque installed near the library entrance, bearing a simple, permanent dedication. Alden realized that the name Vantros would be preserved in history, not as a monument to greed, but as a space for public good. Alden looked toward the library windows where he could see young designers working at drafting tables, their faces focused on the future just as Julian's had been. Alden stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked out of the park. He had finally accepted that the legacy he had lost was safe in Julian's hands. Aventro officially rebranded the Oasis project under the name The Meridian, hiring a new engineering team to systematically repair and reinforce the foundation. It took 6 months of careful work, but we corrected every shortcut Marcus had taken, ensuring the tower met the highest structural standards in the country. The Meridian opened to the public the following spring, its luxury units selling out within weeks. It became a landmark of architectural safety and elegance. Victoria, Sterling, and Julian stood on the penthouse terrace during opening night, looking out over the glowing city skyline they had helped redesign. Victoria smiled, raising her cup to toast their partnership. She told Julian that the market had finally learned the difference between a salesman and an architect. Julian tapped his cup against hers, his face remaining calm and thoughtful as he looked at the glittering tower of the Aventro standing proud in the distance. Julian had no need to speak his victory aloud, and he had no need to gloat. The structures he had built spoke for themselves, standing firm against the wind. The family that betrayed him was gone, their greed having pulled the walls down around them, while the work they had stolen remained ours to complete. For the true architect does not build for status, and he does not build for pride. He builds to create structures that endure long after the conflict clears. Julian walked back inside the penthouse, closed the glass doors, and sat down at the table to review the plans for their next major urban development project. The accounts were settled, the foundation was secure, and the silent revenger was finally at peace, his blueprints safe and his future clear in the city. For sometimes the best revenge isn't loud and it isn't angry. It is simply becoming untouchable, building a world where the betrayer has no place left to stand. Julian closed his sketch journal, switched off the desk lamp, and stepped out into the quiet night. The shadow architect had finished his work and the building was complete.